18, 9 through 14. He, Jesus, also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Welcome, Inspire family, to our podcast, The Follow-Up. I'm joined here with Pastor Randy and Pastor Ernie.
Hey, how y'all doing this morning?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Feeling better.
Good.
Randy, you were a little sick yesterday.
Maybe a little bit.
We probably don't even want to talk about that very much, do we?
Don't.
Because of the nature of it?
No. Many thanks to Ernie and for covering for me. I really appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure.
And from all accounts, it was a good message.
Yeah, so, sure was.
Yep. Well, thanks. It was kind of it's at those times you have to really rely on God and that He's going to get the message out. And you know what? I was pleased with what God did. I learned things while I preached them. You ever find that out, Randy? That it's for us as much as it is for the audience.
Every single week.
Every week I go, did I just say that? Yeah, thank you, God.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
Ernie, so you had this resounding idea throughout your message about it's a fight.
Absolutely. The fight of all the ages. And here, we talked about the all-star wrestling that I used to watch as a kid, and then when I was growing up, then we saw the great Muhammad Ali, and how much I loved to watch fighting, and these days there's MMA, and they just beat the crud out of each other, and I find myself in front of there with some friends sometimes, and we like to watch a fight, but a lot of times we don't see a fight as being actually in church. And I think a profundity that came out of this was lots of fighting goes on in the church over position, over, all kinds of stuff. It happens in boardrooms, happens in conversations in hallways, and then we find out that Jesus is involved with that, and He stands there and He listens to everything we say. Mm-hmm. But I think before we really start this out, we should define these terms. What is a Pharisee? And what is a tax collector? Is that an obvious? Should we do that? Randy, you said some things earlier, what the Pharisees were, and that was very interesting.
So historically, there were basically 4 major kind of groups of people within, maybe 5 actually, of people in Jesus' day that were living in Israel, Palestine, and Jerusalem. You had the Sadducees, who were sort of this religious group who were basically giving up on religion more and just deciding to placate to politics and get along with the Romans.
Yep.
So the Sadducees were in charge of the temple. The Sadducees were the ones who were the primary connection to the Roman, the Romans who were really the ones in charge, right? They were trying to just get along, basically, and keep the peace, which is why they wanted to kill Jesus at the Passover, because He was not keeping the peace, right?
Right. Let's all just get along.
Right, yeah. And in order to get along, we kill people,
Yep.
So then you had the Essenes, who were this very extreme group. They were very apocalyptic, meaning they think that God's going to return. It's going to be this big fire and brimstone moment. But they believed in purity to the point where they separated themselves from the rest of the community. Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, was an Essene community.
John the Baptist was an Essene, wasn't he?
We think John the Baptist was likely an Essene, which was like, he ate locusts and honey and
had his separation from.
Yep. So we think that it's very possible that John had been drawn into that community. And then you have the zealots. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, Simon.
Yeah. Zeal comes from that.
And these are the guys. Barabbas was a zealous. Barabbas,
Yes.
was somebody who wanted to overthrow the Romans, and violence was, of course, the number one way they chose to do this. And literally thousands and thousands of zealots were crucified before and after the time and during the time
Wow.
of Jesus. And then you had the Pharisees, who's one of the characters in this story. One of the things that is important for people to understand is that the Pharisees were probably the most close group to Jesus. They were the most aligned with Jesus in terms of their belief. They took the word Torah very seriously. They took Israel's mission very seriously. It's just that they had gotten to an extreme in how they interpreted things.
Yes.
And Jesus. So whenever we see Jesus confronting the Pharisees, it's really out of love, and it's more like a family fight. He's trying to tell them, trying to right the ship, because probably in them he saw the closest group. We see Joseph of Arimathea, we see Nicodemus, Pharisees who ended up being quite sympathetic and helpful to Jesus. In the end, it was Joseph of Arimathea who gave his tomb for Jesus to use. And so those are the people we see. Then you have just the general populace, who still took their Judaism, their faith seriously, but had to negotiate that within the stresses of everyday life. And so they couldn't follow the law the same way the Pharisees did. And so they always fell short in the eyes of the Pharisees.
Wow.
The other character in our story, the tax collector.
Yes.
Now we know that one of Jesus' disciples, Matthew, was a tax collector.
The Zacchaeus story.
Right. And so here's a Jew who probably just so that he could get by, either inherited it from his father, the position of tax collector, or he bid for it.
Yeah.
But he probably did it because he felt this is the only way I'm going to be able to get by. Maybe there was greed involved when he was younger. We don't know. But we do know this, that the tax collector had a foot in both worlds, the Roman world and the Jewish world, by nature of the fact that they were collecting taxes for the Romans. But what we don't often think about is because he had a foot in both worlds, he had a foot in neither world. In other words, he was accepted by neither group. Yeah. He was ridiculed by the Romans because they saw him as a pawn. He was hated by the Jews because they saw him as a traitor.
Sure.
And so when we see in our little parable here this tax collector, this is the person who is the most ostracized out of anybody, more than the lepers, more than anybody else. This is the one that is most ostracized by the entire known world at that time for them. Jesus took the worst of the worst and put it in a parable, placed them alongside what would have been viewed as the best of the best.
Yeah.
And he tells this story, and he flips everything on its head.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating.
Yeah.
And so the background is helpful, I think, to understand that. I'm glad you asked that, actually. So here's the interesting thing, right? The Pharisee is thought to be the righteous one, the tax collector, the sinner, when in fact what we see is they're both sinners. And it just comes down to who deals with their sin the right way. And in the end, Jesus reveals the Pharisee to be the bigger sinner. Why? Because the Pharisee is playing the game of comparisons.
Oh, yeah.
He is not comparing himself to the righteousness and the holiness of God. He's comparing himself to the tax collector. I'm glad you made me this way. I'm glad I don't do these other things, these adulteries and all these sins of the flesh that we always like to point out. I do the good things. I tithe and I fast and I do it further than I'm even expected to do it. And so I thought of C.S. Lewis when he talks about what's the greatest sin. And theologically for us Christians, we identify the greatest sin as pride is the greatest sin. Pride is the sin of the devil himself, of Lucifer, who says, I'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. And pride is this thing that says, it's not good enough for me to be good. I have to be better than everybody else. Yeah. The root of pride is comparison. And that's what this Pharisee's doing.
Well, and to mention that part where he says, this is the Pharisee speaking, he says, he prayed thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers. And then he says, and even like this tax collector. He's like talking about this guy that's right there, right?
Right.
And he's saying, or even like these guys, I'm not
Talk
like an
about
extortioner.
A passive-aggressive move,
right?
huh?
Oh, my word.
Oh, man.
And really, the undertow of that is what is he doing here in church? Or why is he here at prayer time? Seriously, it's just pride right there. The two huge, I mean, I'm still stuck on foot in both worlds. My goodness, I can't get past that. Why would anybody sign up, to do that? Why would they sign up to do that when they weren't liked by anybody? And then the second thing is, why would this tax collector even find himself near church people if he knew that he was just going to get ridiculed? Do you guys have any ideas on both of them?
Again, these tax collectors, often they inherited it down through the families.
Oh.
So it's possible that, somebody who was in that business, whether it's a Zacchaeus or a Matthew or our fictitious one in this parable, did that. Or they bid. They bid to the Romans, I'll get this much for you. And the Romans said, okay, you're going to get us more, so you get the job. And so it could be in their young youth. They're attracted to the allure of money. They think, well, I'm going to get a lot of money because I can always... When the Pharisee uses the word extortioner in our parable, he is taking a shot at the tax collector because that's how they made their money.
Yes.
They always collected more than they needed to give to the Romans.
Yep.
And in Zacchaeus' case, he collected way more because he was a chief tax collector. So he not only collected his own, but the largesse from the other tax collectors underneath him. Nice little Ponzi scheme going, right? So that's what's going on there. One can only wonder, though, as you get older as a tax collector, at first maybe, hey, I've got this Roman muscle behind me, and look at all this money. But we all know how that allure wears off pretty quickly.
Yeah, it does.
And pretty soon, instead of the shine of the silver and the gold, he starts to notice other things, how the comments from the people. You're a traitor to your people. And he even notices how his Roman muscle probably even makes fun of him. Because they don't respect him. He's just a pawn to them. And so he doesn't. He doesn't have a foot. He's not loved by anybody.
Boy, that's...
He has no tribe. He has no group. He has nobody.
What a lonely, lonely, lonely existence. Do you think that that's what drew this tax collector to come to prayer time?
That's what I was thinking too, because it's like,
thinking?
I think there's a juxtaposition of the Pharisee who thinks he has everybody and thinks has God on his side even. And then this tax collector who he knows he doesn't have any of those things.
Yep.
Which
brings us to this little phrase we were talking about earlier. The 5-word phrase that could be the most insidious, hell-bound phrase ever constructed. I'm a pretty good person.
Oh, wow.
The tax collector understands he's not.
Yep.
He understands it very clearly he's not. But the Pharisee thinks he is.
Oh, my word. That's good. When we finally, this is all over and we're standing before the Lord, do you think we'd be more inclined to build our case to get into heaven? You know what I mean? And that would be the wrong position.
That would be the way of the Pharisee.
To take, and because there's nothing going on here after the fall that's going to get us there. But then again, the third person shows up in that fight, and it's Jesus again as our lawyer, as the one that says, listen, I took this all on myself. I think that tax collector, his heart told him that he needed something else because what he was doing wasn't working. And how many of us are like that? We try to do our best, but then our life hits walls, and if we keep hitting them walls over and over and over again, how's that working for us? And then we say, then what in the heck do I do about that? How many people come here are at that in their lives? And we ask them to think about that yesterday.
Like what you said, what can they do, right?
Yeah.
I think that in a lot of ways in our North Dakotan culture and in our culture on a large scale, it says, okay, pick yourself up. Or
yes,
you are not accountable to anyone. You got to do this. This is all your job.
Yep.
Wash your face, right?
You're very
You got to do everything.
You went to Fuller Seminary, for goodness sake. You know all the answers, right? I mean, we think that we still have to earn this, and Jesus comes and he settles this and sets the record straight. And
so what's wrong with those statements? I guess that's the question. What's wrong with the statement? Pick yourself up in that there's no other qualifiers.
What do you think, Rand?
Well, I think like almost all statements that are these kind of little quotes that we like, there's a hint of truth to them, and then there's a side to. They're all two-edged swords.
Mm-hmm.
There's an edge that there's truth to it, where in other words, be responsible for yourself. Don't expect other people to do things for you. Don't expect other people to, make your way. Sure, but the other side of the edge is what? It leads to a very, very dangerous pride.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? Where we don't realize that we should also, at the same time, love and rely on others. This is where so many people, especially men, struggle with love. Is they're okay with the idea of somehow giving or expressing love, but they really struggle with receiving love.
Yes.
And so in the end, it's not really love that's going on. Really, it's John Ortberg said in a book once. He said, to have healthy relationships, you can't always be the strong one. And there's no truer statement.
Good.
Not only in our marriages, right? You can't always be the strong one, husband, in the marriage. You have to let your wife be the strong. There are times when your wife is the stronger one. But, of course, think about that in our relationship to God in our parable. Who's the strong one by the world's... It's the Pharisee, right? But it's the tax collector who says, I'm not the strong one.
Another guy later
there's
said...
me, God, and there's you.
He said, you can be married or you can be right. there it was.
Right, but that's more of a that's almost more of a just an accommodation.
Yeah.
Where here we're talking about a very authentic, true, honest assessment, acknowledgement, realization that this tax collector's like, there is nobody for me to compare myself to feel better about. I'm the worst of the worst, and I know it. I know it. And he just asks for mercy. He just humbles himself. It says he falls to his knees. Doesn't it say from a distance in the story? From a distance. He doesn't even come, right? The Pharisee probably does it in front of everybody.
Yeah, standing
Look at me,
far off.
right?
There you go. Yep.
And he's standing far off. And I think Jesus really sees people who are standing far off.
Absolutely.
He sees the people who are standing over. Think about the woman who was bleeding, the lepers, the people who are desperate. He sees the people we don't see, the rest of the world doesn't see, which has interesting implications for how we should be living our lives as Christians.
Yeah.
Do we see the people who are standing far off, who are broken and desperate, and then do we will we connect to them?
Absolutely.
But not because we're better, but because we see ourselves in them too.
Oh yeah.
And obviously, I talked about yesterday our family history, the great-grandfather that ran away from the Quaker colony and never turned back, and then taught that to his kids, and then along the line, my grandfather was born, and then he followed the ways of his dad, and then my dad came along, and his life was not working for him, and a group from the church came across the tracks to a very poor family. And I was wondering what was going on in that church that made them so humble that they would think that they needed to come across the tracks to help a family who could probably never give them tithe, never give them offering.
Right.
They weren't any good
Yep.
for the positive momentum of the church other than they were lost souls. And so kudos to that. And then I juxtaposed that against when I was a pastor later on, and in a town in South Dakota, and we had this member of the board who was very, very affluent, and he called the shots in a lot of the meetings. If he said it, people wanted to do it. I remember one Sunday walking into the church, him being so frustrated because I had just brought the busload kids into the church. Remember the bus ministries of the past?
Yeah.
We had 15, 20 kids on that bus that would come every single week, and we'd just stop by the corners and pick them up. And he had one by the ear that Sunday, telling him he would never run in that church ever again, and he was not to come back. And this was like an 8-year-old boy. I remember the 8-year-old boy running out of the church and seeing him run across the field. And I never saw him ever again. in church, the 8-year-old boy, and I often questioned, was that the right thing to do? I realize we have to have order, but we also have to have understanding, and we have to have God here. What do you guys think?
You know, when we talked about the Good Samaritan a few Sundays ago, and we decided to help this young lady in our neighborhood,
Yeah.
which we are so grateful for everybody who responded to that. And now we're taking some good movements now also to set ourselves up more long term there. But what a story that maybe people don't understand that would be helpful is that when I say we approach the people standing far off, either because of their brokenness or their destitution, their poorness, their sin, whatever it is, all those things that tend to isolate us, I have a soft spot for people who are in this position because I know what it's like to be in that position. When I graduated college, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee for a year to try and make it in the Christian music business.
Yeah.
And it didn't take long. It took, probably all of 10 or 11 months before I pretty much burned through my savings. And I wasn't being lazy. It's just that there wasn't a lot of opportunity, and it was hard to get by. And I literally got to a point where I didn't know where the next meal was coming from.
Wow.
I didn't have any money. And there were people who very quietly saw it and noticed it and helped out. I remember this lady who was my boss would say, "So, Randy, have you had your ramen noodles today? Have you had the kinds of things you eat when you barely have any money?" And I'd say, "No, I haven't had my ramen noodles." And she said, "Well, you better let me take you to lunch." And I just remember the position of that and what it felt like. And I also remember just the incredible kindness of people. So I tend to see myself in these people. I still remember what that feels like. And so when we think about people who are far off, we have to remember when we were far off, when we were destitute, when we were sinners, right? Or whatever sin we're struggling with. We have to associate with those people. Remember, Jesus came, leaves his throne, and takes on flesh upon himself. This is called incarnational ministry, the Latin incarnate, to take flesh upon. He becomes one of us. He takes our brokenness on himself. This is a model for us. We have to take that. We have to take that kind of position in the world, which requires humility, not the self-righteousness of the Pharisee.
Yes.
And it's not just the down and out, the poor, the physically poor, the financially poor. This man was very rich, the tax collector, but he was very poor, right? There should be something it's not a socioeconomic thing necessarily.
Not in his case.
Not in his case, it surely wasn't. But there was a man loaded down, worse than a pack mule, with sins.
Yep.
And he still had to go to the same place that everybody else has to go. What do you think about that, Sage?
It just makes me think of when you say loaded down like a pack meal. Makes me think of when Christ says, "Take my yoke."
I know. I know.
Take my yoke because it's light. I'm gonna be guiding you here, so you're gonna have to submit in that way, in some way.
Right.
But I have a light burden here,
Yep.
and I'm gonna release that heavy yoke from your shoulders.
Well, and what's beautiful about that little word, that set of words he uses, is anybody, we don't understand this today because we're not real agrarian, at least not. But the idea is when you yoked oxen together, you always yoked the younger with an older one that could bear more of the burden and to kind of show the younger one.
Interesting.
So he's not just saying, take this yoke, but basically be yoked to me because I will bear your burden, is what he's saying. I will bear it. And boy, we know that not only did he bear it on the cross, but when you decide to walk with him in your life and to take your sin seriously.
Yes.
See, right, we talked about this. This story is not about a reversal of the status of sinner. It's not like Jesus is saying, oh, it's the Pharisee who's a sinner and it's the tax collector who's not. That's not what he's saying. He said only one walked away justified before God.
Yeah.
They were both sinners. And we don't want to do this bad theology that says, oh, well, the tax collector is the good one in the story, so I guess it doesn't matter what I do in my life as long as I just tell God I'm sorry. No, that's not what Jesus is saying.
Boy, that's profound.
He's not saying that. He's saying we're all sinners. We have to take our sin seriously. And I love that you brought up that verse, Sage. Yoke yourself to me, and I'll bear your sin, but I'll also guide you into a life where sin is no longer your master.
Yes.
You may
Yes.
struggle with sin your whole life, and we do, right?
Yeah.
At least this side of things.
Yeah.
But Jesus will walk alongside us and will be yoked to him, and sin, though may be present in our lives, and we'll probably notice it more actually when we're
Yeah.
but it won't bear the heavy weight that it does.
Yep.
Absolutely.
The most profound thing, and I think we probably should, I mean, we're about done with this. To me, when I studied this sermon, all 20 minutes of it, when God just hit me with it, is something that I hadn't really contemplated before, is Jesus being the third guy in the fight and his ability to listen to every conversation that we say. He listened and he saw the Pharisee, even when he was going on and on and on about how he deserved this. Well, we forget that the little mumbles of a guy far away, Jesus heard those too. And we have to remember in our church boardrooms, we have to remember whether we're here or whether we're at work or whatever, he continues to listen in on what we say, and he does have something to say about the motives and the attitudes that we bring to the table when we are dealing with each other.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Very good. Good place to end, I think.
Yeah. All right, Inspire family. Thank you for joining us again on our podcast, The Follow Up. You guys have a great week. God bless.